Good morning. It is certainly good to be with you this morning. I'm certainly glad that we have this opportunity to be here, those of like precious faith, as we are assembled here and we are worshiping the Father in spirit and truth as we're commanded there in John chapter number 4. And verse number 24. You know, for a little while now, we've been looking at a series of lessons dealing with types and antitypes, and we are going to continue on with that study this morning. And the study that we're going to look at this morning is going to be that of the Passover Lamb and Christ. And you know, it's very interesting. If you go over to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter number 5, and as you're turning over there, Paul is going to actually identify Christ as being our Passover Lamb. And so there we have the Bible calling the Passover Lamb and Christ having that type-antitype relationship. Now it is interesting there in 1 Corinthians chapter number 5, that Paul is dealing with Christ being our Passover, as he's really going to be dealing with church discipline in a sense, because you remember there in 1 Corinthians chapter number 5, there was that brother that was involved in sin, and the church there in Corinth, instead of dealing with it, they were just accepting him in the situation that he was in. And so what Paul is really telling them they need to do, they need to purge out that old lump. Notice there in 1 Corinthians chapter number 5, verses 7 and 8. He says, "Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, even as ye are unleavened, for even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice or wickedness, but with unleavened bread of sincerity and in truth." And so notice there Paul is saying you need to purge out that leaven, get rid of that impurity, because our Passover lamb is Christ. And we're going to note some similarities between the Passover lamb and Christ this morning. So if you're taking notes, I have 3 points for your consideration that we're going to look at this morning. Understanding that we're talking about the Passover lamb, which was a sacrifice. Looking at Christ, who is the Lamb of God, who is our sacrifice. And so it's through that lens that we will be viewing this relationship. So the 3 points then for your consideration is point number 1, the sacrifice was perfect. The sacrifice was perfect. Point number 2, the sacrifice was for salvation. The sacrifice was for salvation. And finally, point number 3, the sacrifice needs to be remembered. The sacrifice remembered. So the sacrifice was perfect, the sacrifice was for salvation, and the sacrifice remembered. The 3 things that we're going to consider this morning. So let's not waste any time. Let's get right into our text. The sacrifice was perfect. Let's first consider that Passover lamb. If you will, be turning over to Exodus chapter number 12, and I would encourage you this morning to put a marker in Exodus chapter number 12, because we're going to be turning back here a lot to get information regarding the Passover lamb. But we'll be going to the New Testament to get the information that we want to look at in regards to Christ and that relationship. But the first thing that we're dealing with then was the sacrifice was perfect. Notice the first thing about the lamb is that the lamb had to be without blemish. There in Exodus chapter number 12, and starting in verse number 1, they're told about the Passover. There in verse number 3, Moses and Aaron was told to speak to the congregation of Israel. They gave them the date for when they were to observe the Passover. But you notice there was to be a lamb for their house at the end of verse number 3. And then in verse number 4 it says, "If the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of souls. Every man according to his eating shall make your count for the lamb." Now look at verse number 5. "Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. Ye shall take it from the sheep or from the goats." So notice that the sacrifice that they were to offer was to be one without blemish. Now the idea there, the one without blemish, as far as looking at the lamb was concerned, it had to be a perfect lamb in this sense. It couldn't be the lamb that was lame. It couldn't be missing a leg. You couldn't go out there and say, well, I know we got to make this sacrifice for God, but I got this lamb over here that only has 3 legs and it's really slowing me down. Why don't I just offer that to God? Well, we know that wasn't acceptable according to the passage here in Exodus chapter number 12, but also the prophet Malachi would deal with this. There in Malachi chapter number 2, and even in chapter number 1, he would ask them, would ye rob God? And of course the answer to that was they were robbing God. Why? Because of the sacrifices that they were offering. Malachi even made the argument. He said, you take this sacrifice that you're offering to God and go offer it to your governor and see if it would be pleased. And of course the answer to that was no. The governor would not be pleased. Boy, that's a lesson, right? Could we take the stuff that we offer to God today and give it to the president and he'd be happy about it? If the answer to that is no, then we probably ought to reconsider what we're giving to God. That's extra, has nothing to do with the lesson. But notice this lamb was to be blemish. Without blemish, he was to be perfect. We think about Jesus, our Passover, as seen there in 1 Corinthians chapter number 5, verses 7 through 8. Our Passover lamb was perfect as well. And I'm not saying that Jesus only had 1 leg. We understand that he was perfect in that sense. But the perfect that we're talking about was he was without sin. 2 passages for your consideration this morning as far as that is concerned. The first one is Hebrews chapter number 4. At verse number 15, Hebrews chapter number 4 and verse number 15. Notice what it says. It says, for we have not a high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin. And so we know Christ, he would go through, he would endure the same trials, the same tribulations, the same temptations as you and I are, yet what? He was without sin. He was perfect. Look at another passage. 1 Peter chapter number 2. 1 Peter chapter number 2. And note there in verse number 22. 1 Peter chapter number 2 in verse number 22. He said, talking about Christ, you can see that from verse number 21. But it said, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth. Who, when he was reviled not again. When he suffered, he threatened not, but committed himself to him that judgeth righteously. Notice there was no guile found within his mouth. Really there, the Hebrew writer really looking at Jesus really throughout his entire life, but really think about when he's on the cross. When they're hurling all those accusations during that illegal trial, and on the cross, what did Christ do? Nothing. As we read this morning, even there in that reading before the Lord's Supper, they're saying, if he be the Son of God, let him come down from the cross. No, Jesus is not going to do that. That wouldn't have changed their belief. When they smote him, he didn't smite them back. See, he was perfect. He had no sin. Just as that Passover lamb was without blemish, so was Jesus without blemish. He was perfect. But another aspect to the idea of it being perfect was kind of the preparation for the sacrifice. Go back to Exodus chapter number 12. But this time I want to encourage you to move down later in the chapter and notice what's said about this Passover lamb there in verse number 46. Talking about the Passover lamb and how they're going to keep it, but in one house shall it be eaten. Thou shalt not carry it forth out of the flesh abroad, out of the house. Neither shall ye break a bone thereof. Now that's important. As they are preparing this Passover lamb, as they are eating it, as they're doing all the things that are necessary to kill this lamb and to eat of that supper, one of the things that they were not allowed to do, they were not allowed to break a bone in the body of the lamb. Now, you know as well as I do why that's significant, right? Keeping in mind where we started in 1 Corinthians chapter number 5 and verse number 7, Christ being our Passover, whereas He is being that sacrifice, as He is preparing Himself to die, even as He died there upon the cross, what was not done to Him? There was no bones in His body broken. Go over to the gospel record of John chapter number 19, and John brings this out. In John chapter number 19, starting there in verse number 32. And you remember, you go back up to verse number 31, and here come the hypocritical Jews, and they say, Pilate, we have this custom. We don't need a dead body hanging outside before our holy day. You need to take that down. And so Pilate says, okay, we're going to do that. And so he sends the Roman soldiers, verse number 32. Then came the soldiers and brake the legs of the first and of the other which was crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was not dead already, they brake not his legs. But one of the soldiers with the spear pierced his side, and forthwith came out blood and water. And he that saw it bare record, and his record is true, and knoweth that he saith is true, that ye might believe. Now note verse 36, for all these things were done, that the scripture should be fulfilled, a bone of him should not be broken. Verse number 36. And so there is there in the book of Psalms, the psalmist would write according to that the bones would not be broken. But in lieu of the Passover relationship, the Passover lamb relationship, when that lamb was being prepared for the feast, you're going to do all these things, but you're not going to break a bone. The Christ, He's going to have to go through all these things, but they're not going to break His bones. It's a beautiful relationship between the Passover lamb and the Christ. And think about everything that Christ went through up into and even the cross. When you think about everything that would entail preparing that lamb, picking him out and holding him out for the days, and then, the process of actually killing that lamb. And the killing of that lamb, that perfect lamb, was going to provide salvation for the people. All the things that Christ went through to the cross and everything going up to that was necessary for the salvation of His people. And that brings us into point number 2. That the sacrifice was for salvation. Not only was that sacrifice perfect, but it was for salvation. Now, the salvation is a little bit different, but we understand the connections. When you go back to Exodus chapter number 12, notice that this sacrifice had to be done before Israel could have salvation. That's an important point. This process had to be done before the salvation of Israel. Notice there in Exodus chapter number 12, and if you'll allow me, we're going to do just a little bit of reading here. But I want to pick up in verse number 6 because we've already read verse number 5. Verse number 6, and ye shall keep it unto the 14th day of the same month of the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And they shall take the blood and strike it on the 2 sides of the post and upon and the upper door post of the house wherein they shall eat it. And they shall eat the flesh in that night and roast it with fire and unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Eat it not of raw nor sodden at all with water, but roast it with fire, his head with his legs, and with the puritance thereof. And ye shall let nothing of it remain until the morning. That which remaineth of it until the morning ye shall burn with fire. And thus shall ye eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, and the staff in your hand, and ye shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will pass through the land of the Egypt that night, and will smite the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, against all the gods of Egypt. I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now note verse 13. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses wherein ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. Now here it is. All of that we just read from verse number 5 to verse number 13, all of that had to be done. And it was not until that point that Israel had salvation. Now, what happens if Israel leaves any part of that process out? They would be destroyed. Just as it makes mention there at the end of verse number 13, he says, I shall not destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. But if something wasn't done, if you thought you could get through the evening without having that Passover lamb, you were wrong. If you thought you could get through that evening without having the blood on the doorpost and on the lintel, you were wrong. If you thought you could partake of that feast in any other way except what was commanded, if you thought you could do anything else with that lamb except what was commanded and make it through the night, you were wrong. Salvation was not possible for Israel until that sacrifice was made. Salvation was not possible for Israel until that sacrifice was made. You know, we could certainly say the same thing about you and I, right? It is impossible for man to have salvation unless our Passover, Christ, is sacrificed for us. Turn over to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews chapter number 9. And we want to look at verses 15 to 17. Hebrews chapter number 9, looking at verses 15 to 17. And for this cause he is the mediator of the New Testament, that by means of death, for the redemption of the transgressions that were under the first testament, they which are called might receive the promises of eternal inheritance. For where a testament is, there must also of necessity be the death of the testator. For a testament is of force after men are dead. Otherwise, it is of no strength at all. Why the testator liveth. What's the point? Without the sacrifice of Christ, salvation for you and I is impossible. As a matter of fact, you go over just one chapter to Hebrews chapter number 10, and you look at verse number 4. It's not possible that the blood of bulls and goats could take away sin. And so we do not have remission of sins. We don't have the blessings of the New Testament if not for the sacrifice of our Passover. Now we realize, now here's the interesting thing, just as there was things that they had to do for that sacrifice and for things to work, guess what? There are things that you and I have to do for that sacrifice and for that sacrifice to work. And probably the best way that I can illustrate it is we have to do what Jesus did. Just as Jesus died, was buried, and was resurrected, and making salvation possible for me and you, we too must also die, be buried, and resurrected for salvation to be possible. Look at Romans chapter number 6. We've talked about this before, and so this is nothing new, just a reminder. But Romans chapter number 6, notice what Paul writes. There, and let's just start in verse number 3. Romans chapter number 6 and verse number 3. Know ye not that so many of us were baptized into Jesus Christ, were baptized into his death? Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised up from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life. Where we have been planted together in the likeness of his death, we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection. And so Christ, there was something that he had to do for salvation to be possible. There's also something that you and I must do for salvation to be possible. But note again, salvation was not possible for the Israelites until that Passover sacrifice was completed. Salvation is not possible for you and I until that Passover Lamb of Christ, until his sacrifice is completed and we reenact through the death, the burial, and resurrection of baptism is salvation possible. Notice the elements of this sacrifice that was for salvation. We already read some of these verses, so it's not necessary to look at them again. But notice, and because I want to look at some of the similarities as we deal with Christ and His sacrifice, notice the people of Israel, part of that sacrifice working and part of that sacrifice having to be completed is they had to be covered in the blood of the Lamb. If you note specifically at Exodus chapter number 12, in verse number 7, they were to take the blood of that Passover lamb that they had just sacrificed, and they were to put it on the doorposts and the door lintel. And so then they would walk into that house, and what are they? They are now covered by the blood of the Lamb. Well, isn't that true with you and I? As far as salvation is concerned, we must be covered by the Lamb of God. Look over at 1 Peter chapter number 1. 1 Peter chapter number 1. And look at verse number 7. 1 Peter chapter number 1 and look at verse number 7. That is not the passage I want. That's a good passage, but it's not the passage I want. Maybe it's 2 Peter. I may have transposed some numbers wrong. Well, isn't that awful? I tell you what, we're going to use this passage in 1 Peter chapter number 1. Look at verse number 19. I got 1 Peter chapter 1 verse 7, but that's not the passage I want. But this one will work. We'll tie it with another passage so you can see it. 1 Peter chapter number 1, look at verse number 18. For as much as ye know that we are not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold from the vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. That's 1 Peter chapter number 1, verses 18 and 20. And we are covered by that blood. 1 Peter chapter number 3, verse number 20 and 21, in baptism. Also Galatians chapter number 3 and verse number 27, we are baptized into His death. So we must be covered by the blood of Christ. Now, elaborating on that point just a little bit further. Not only were those people covered in Israel by the blood of the Lamb as they went into that door that was covered with the blood, but after being covered by the blood, in verse number 13 of Exodus chapter number 12, it says that I will pass over your house after I see the blood. And so you can just imagine then, that if you want to call it this, the death angel or God as He's going through the land of Egypt. In my mind's eye, you may picture it a little bit differently. I just imagine Him floating over the land. Now, I'm not saying that this is how my mind's eye visuals. I've visualized it this way for many years, and I just can't get the visual out of my head. But I just imagine the angel floating over the houses and looking for blood. I see the blood, so I'm going to pass over your house. I see the blood, I'm going to pass over your house. Oh, there's a house here. Don't have the blood. The firstborn in that house is going to die because I do not see blood. Well, isn't that true for you and I when we talk about baptism? We're covered by the precious blood of Christ, and it's by His blood. See, the blood of the Passover lamb took that death away. That death angel going over the land. I see the blood. I'm taking death away. We are covered by the blood of Christ, and it takes away sin. Consider the words of John in John chapter number 1 and verse number 29. This is John the Apostle writing, but he's actually recording the words of John the Immerser there in John chapter number 1. John chapter number 1 and verse number 29. Notice what John says. The next day, John chapter 1 verse 29. The next day John seeth Jesus coming unto him and saith, Behold the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sins of the world. Now we realize that He's taking away the sins of the world. He's not making it to where sins are not possible in the world, but He removes the sin from us. He makes it possible to stand before God. And God can say, the judge will say, Jesus in that day, I see that this person is covered in my blood. Father, I know him. He's one of mine. He's covered in blood. That brings about salvation. Point number 3, and the final point for your consideration this morning. Not only was that sacrifice perfect, not only was that sacrifice for salvation, but it was such a significant event in history that it needed to be remembered. You know, tomorrow is the actual holiday, although a lot of people celebrated it yesterday. But tomorrow there's a national holiday called Memorial Day. And it's supposed to be an opportunity for people to remember those who lost their lives to allow us the freedoms that we have. You know, a lot of people, I mean, if you would have came to my house today, we did like probably a lot of people did. We had some barbecue and stuff like that. That's not what Memorial Day is about. It's not about barbecue. It's about remembering those that have died so we can enjoy the barbecue, if you allow me to put it that way. These two events that we're talking about, the Passover and the death of Christ, were such significant events that they needed to be remembered. Need to be remembered in the case of Christ. You go back to Exodus chapter number 12 and allow me to maybe do a little more reading here so we understand the significance of this. But the death of the Passover was to be celebrated, 2 points, and we're going to get them at once. Was to be celebrated, 1, by the children of Israel, so it was person specific. And 2, it was to be celebrated annually. And so let's note some verses here. Exodus chapter number 12, starting in verse number 14. And this day shall be unto you for memorial, and ye shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Ye shall keep it a feast by an ordinance forever. 7 days shall ye eat unleavened bread. Even the first day ye shall put away leaven out of your houses. For whosoever eateth leavened bread from the first day unto the 7th day, that soul shall be cut off from Israel. And the first day thereof there shall be a holy convocation. The 7th day there shall be a holy convocation to you. No manner of work shall be done in them, save that which every man must eat, that only may be done of you. And ye shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in the selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall ye observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever. In the first month, the 14th day of the month, even ye shall eat unleavened bread until 21st day of the month at even. 7 days there shall be no leaven found in your houses, for whosoever eateth that which is leavened, even that soul shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whereat he had been a stranger or born in the land. Ye shall eat nothing leavened, in all your habitations shall ye eat unleavened bread. Then Moses called for all the elders and said unto them, draw out and take your lamb according to your families and kill the Passover. And so he's going to give them instructions. But notice, it is to be a memorial. It is to be for the children of Israel. Notice, the elders of Israel. You are called, you're getting your families, and you need to do this. And it's going to be a memorial. It's something you're going to remember every year. It's not for the Gentiles. It's for Israel. It's something that is so important, so significant, that you need to remember it every year. But also, note how significant it is that not only did they need to remember it, they needed to tell others about it. Look at verse number 24 of Exodus chapter number 12. And ye shall observe this thing for an ordinance to thee and to thy sons forever. And it shall come to pass when ye be come into the land. So now Moses is looking years into the future. They have just got out of Egypt. Remember, they're going to have to wander in the wilderness. But Moses is looking at the future. When you get into that promised land and you're still observing this feast, notice what it says. And it shall come to pass, when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, according as he hath promised, that ye shall keep this service. Now look at verse 26. And it shall come to pass, when your children shall say unto you, what mean ye by this service? Now there's a great teaching opportunity. He said, you're going to be in the land, and it's going to become the time of the Passover, and you're going to see as a child, you're going to see your mom going through the house and getting rid of anything that has leaven in it. You're going to see your dad getting a lamb and separating it. You're going to see the family come together after killing this lamb. And as a little child, you're going to ask, Mom, Dad, why are we doing this? Look at verse 27. Then ye shall say, it is the sacrifice of the Lord's Passover, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians and delivered our houses, and the people bowed the head and worship. He says it's a great opportunity. When your son or your daughter asks you why you're doing this thing, it gives you as a parent an opportunity to set them down and say, let me tell you about something amazing that God did for us. See, we were slaves in Egypt. And through 10 plagues, God got us released from Egypt. And that last plague, God put a provision in there for us to be safe. And that caused the Egyptians to let us go. And so now we're remembering what God did. Do you see the beautiful relationship with Christ, our Passover? See, when we talk about Christ and his sacrifice, it is such a significant event in human history that it's not like the Passover. It's not even like our it's not even like our holiday, Memorial Day. There we go. I'll get it together. See, Memorial Day, we look at that one time a year. They looked at the Passover one time a year. No, the sacrifice of Christ was such a significant event that it's remembered every first day of the week. It's remembered by Christians, and it's something that should drive us to tell others. I'll give you 3 passages really quickly. The first one I want to look at is actually just 2. I think we can get it in 2. First one I want to give you is Acts chapter number 20. Acts chapter number 20. And let's look at verse number 7. Acts chapter number 20 and verse number 7. And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech till midnight. Well, what does Acts chapter 20 and verse number 7 have to do with anything? It shows the principle that they were coming together upon the first day of the week. Question, how many weeks have a first day? Every single one of them. And so you have the principle of coming together on the first day of the week to break bread. That's a figure of speech in reference to the Lord's Supper. And so it was done every first day of the week. Acts chapter 20 and verse number 7. Every first day of the week. And it's remembered by Christians. Go over to Acts chapter number 20, not Acts, Matthew chapter number 26. Matthew chapter number 26. As Jesus is instituting the Lord's Supper, as they were eating, this is Matthew chapter number 26, starting in verse number 26. And as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, Take, eat, this is my body. And he took the cup and gave thanks and gave it to them, saying, Drink ye all of it, for this is my blood of the New Testament, which was shed for many by the remission of sins. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom. Cross-reference that over to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. I'm going to give you this third one that I've got written here, just to make the point. 1 Corinthians chapter number 11. And we know the verses, and so we're not going to read them all. But starting there in verse number 23, Paul is talking about the Lord's Supper. He's talking to the church of Corinth. So Christians are remembering the Lord's death. There are those in denominations that probably some of them this morning, they ate a cracker and they drank some grape juice, but I'm telling you, they did not remember the Lord's death. Because it's for Christians And there are not Christians in denominations. Now, if you have a question about that statement, please see me. We don't have time to deal with it this morning. But we can show you from the Scripture why that statement is true. So it's Christians that observed it. They observed it every first day of the week. But it was something that was so significant. Not only did they observe it every first day of the week, but it was something that should cause them to teach. Look at verse number 26 of 1 Corinthians chapter 11. For as often as ye eat this bread and drink this cup, you do show the Lord's death till he come. That word show, another way that you can translate that word is proclaim. Brethren, proclaiming is teaching. And so when we partake of the Lord's Supper, we are teaching about the death of Jesus. But I want to give that illustration that we used in Exodus really quickly. You ever seen children during the Lord's Supper, young children? They're curious. They want to know why mom and dad or grandma and grandpa or aunt and uncle, whoever the case may be, they want to know why. You think about little kids. They want to know why grandma gets to eat a cracker and gets to drink some grape juice when I don't. Why don't I get to eat that cracker? Why don't I get to drink the grape juice? Why are you eating the cracker? Why are you drinking the grape juice? Doesn't it provide a great opportunity? As a parent, as a grandparent, let me tell you why we're eating of the unleavened bread. Let me tell you why we're drinking of the fruit of the vine, because we're doing it to remember Jesus. We're doing it to remember the perfect life in which he lived. We're doing it to remember the fact that he gave that life upon the cross so that we can have a home with him in heaven. Isn't that beautiful? And that's what I want to leave you on this morning, that beautiful thought. That we can be with Christ in heaven. You know, the children of Israel, if they were obedient during the time of the Passover, they escaped death, physical death. You and I, if we are obedient in regards to our Passover, the Passover Lamb Christ, we too can escape death. Now, you're not going to escape physical death, but you can escape spiritual death. Will you do what's necessary this morning? If you're here and you're not a child of God, we encourage you to do those things. Hearing God's word, believing, repenting, confessing, being buried with him in that watery grave of baptism, and living faithfully all the days of your life. Maybe you're here this morning, you are a child of God, but maybe you haven't been living like it. Why not take time this morning to make your life right with him? If you're here this morning and you're subject to the Lord's invitation, we encourage you to come as together we stand and we sing.